Welcome to the American Hospital Association's webinar for trustees titled, Who Are Your Next Gen Leaders? This session is brought to you by the AHA Trustee Services. Our presenter today is Bill Westwood. Bill is a senior client partner in Korn Ferry's advisory group, based in the firm's Chicago office. His work primarily focuses on executive assessment, executive coaching, and succession planning. In this session, Bill will explore one of the most critical priorities for healthcare organizations, how to identify next-generation leaders. Bill?
Stephanie, thank you so much, and welcome to everyone who is listening and viewing this webinar. Those of you who might have heard my last webinar on CEO succession know that we talked about how to choose the best candidate for that role using a rigorous, thorough process that directly involves the board. But what we also know is that while CEOs matter a lot, talented leaders deeper in the organization matter even more. They are the leaders who inspire employees across the organization to be more engaged and energized. They help the organization adjust rapidly and effectively to a disruptive healthcare environment, and they are on the front line of coaching and mentoring newly emerging leaders as well. And in an era when talent is becoming harder to find with very low levels of unemployment, it's becoming harder to retain in this intensively competitive healthcare environment. And the demands on these leaders have never been greater as the regulatory, competitive, and financial forces impact healthcare providers. Identifying this next generation of leaders is among the most critical priorities that a healthcare organization faces. So what to do? How do we identify them? How do we nurture their development? How do we ensure that they are ready when they're called upon? Let's consider some of the challenges that healthcare organizations face in identifying and developing these leaders. Some of the common pitfalls that organizations face in this light are what we call the promotion to failure syndrome. That is, where leaders are promoted into roles without fully understanding if they are ready or not. When high potentials leave because succession lacks transparency or is thought to be based on who you know rather than what you're capable of doing. Where benches are weak, that is, there are few, if any, identified successors for key high-value roles. And when those roles are clear, but there aren't enough viable successors in the pipeline for them. Another factor is that the pipeline may not be sufficiently diverse to support the inclusive strategy of the healthcare organization. And at times there is a misidentification of high potential leaders due to a lack of sophistication among the managers who are selecting or not selecting them. Finally, a pitfall is communicating that becoming a high potential or becoming promoted is a right rather than a responsibility and could be achieved through time and grade rather than meeting the specific requirements and demands of a leader. And research that several prominent organizations have conducted confirm these key concerns, as you can see in this bar graph. Many report a significant shortage of leaders for key positions. Nearly half have no systemic process to identify and develop those leaders, and 4 in 10 find that their promotion of high potentials or those that they believed were high potential end in failure. And while these results are not unique to healthcare organizations, they are at least as prominent in them as elsewhere. Korn Ferry undertook its own survey last year of the next generation of leaders, and we wanted to look at more depth in terms of what these organizations are finding. And these are some of the findings that were most prominent for us. In other words, the dissatisfaction with the status quo that the last graphic just reflected. That is, what we're doing isn't working. A second factor is that too much talent is being bought rather than built. Organizations, and this is certainly true in healthcare, have to go outside far too often rather than being able to promote from within. And one reason for that is that succession planning does not go deep enough. That is, it is not at levels below the C-suite quite often in organizations with which we're familiar. There is also confusion about potential versus performance. That is, how do we determine potential if it's not simply a reflection of someone's performance on the job? And a conclusion that, again, we noted earlier, there's simply not enough of ready-now talent. When a vacancy occurs, we just don't have the people who are ready and able to fill it. So why is it that these issues are so difficult to address? Some of the underlying causes that we know are true are reflected on this page. For example, most executives overrate the performance of their direct reports. Secondly, they confuse high performance with high potential. That is, they equate the two when research done by many organizations indicates that potential is not directly a reflection of performance. Third, most executives fail to consider potential for what? That is, potential, for example, for a broad leadership role, potential for a high-impact individual contributor role, or potential for leading a function. Each of those roles has different requirements, and the potential indicated by an individual may be more suited for one than for another. Fourth, most executives are unwilling to differentiate the development of their talent. And what does this mean? It means essentially that it is the ripple effect of ensuring that everyone has an equal access to development. What we know from research, though, is that different development strategies need to be applied differently depending upon the roles and opportunities that people seek and are most well suited for. And finally, fifth, most executives consider readiness for promotion based on the achievements of past requirements rather than a match with the demands of a new role. In our experience, a healthcare organization needs to take an organized, planful approach to identifying its next generation leaders. And what exactly do we mean by an organized, planful approach? At a high level, these are the 4 key steps that we believe healthcare organizations need to follow. First, they need to use a set of uniform standards and methods to look at the talent they have. This is represented on this graphic by making a diagnosis or standing on the scales. Second, they need to bring the collective wisdom of colleagues to bear on these individual assessments that have been done in step 1 and deploy a rigorous dialogue amongst themselves to confirm or deny the actual potential of the people who are being assessed, as well as their performance. Step number 2. Step number 3 is to, in fact, determine what development strategies will benefit each person most. And as we look at people with different levels of performance and potential, as I mentioned before, it's important to differentiate the development strategies that will best suit people at different points along those 2 dimensions. And finally, it's critical that there be follow-up and accountability for development commitments that are made in step number 3. One area where this process can fall apart is when all the planful work is done in steps 1 through 3, but no one takes the time or makes the effort to follow up on the commitments that have been made to develop high potentials into next generation leaders. So now let's just remind ourselves, for those of you who completed the earlier webinar I led, of what it is that we want to look at or consider when we're looking at next generation leaders. And fortunately, it turns out to be the same set of characteristics that we look at in a CEO. Again, our research indicates that these 4 dimensions, competencies and experiences at the top and traits and drivers at the bottom, are in their entirety a reflection of the leadership potential and capabilities of either a next generation leader or of a CEO. So what exactly are these qualities? And let me just offer a brief refresher. Competencies, for the most part, are the behaviors that leaders manifest, what you can observe in them, and the impact that they can have. So communication skills would be an example of a very good competency. Experiences are those things that shape and test leaders, including the hardships that they undertake and even the failures that they may experience. But all of those go into the makeup of a prospective leader. These 2 elements, competencies and experiences, as we indicate, are easier to observe and to build, whereas the 2 qualities at the bottom, the traits and drivers, are both harder to observe and harder to build, though not impossible. In terms of traits, we think here primarily of personality characteristics. Qualities like humility, empathy, for example, are examples of traits that may be manifest and we might be able to see at times, but are more difficult to penetrate. And drivers include the motives that get us up every day and convey energy that provide the fuel for our success as leaders or as individual contributors. With these in mind, let's take a somewhat closer look at this somewhat elusive notion of leadership potential, because when we talk about next generation leaders, we have to envision, in fact, at times even imagine what they might be capable of in the future as opposed to what they're doing today. So what do we want to look at in more depth with respect to these next generation leaders? This graphic gives a good summary of the qualities that are most important in our experience and in the research with respect to leadership potential. So let's work our way down the left column and begin with the personality factors or leadership dispositions. As I mentioned, qualities like empathy, humility, and confidence would be contributors to leadership potential if they are at high levels based on the leadership research that is most current. We also look in the second box at someone's aptitude for logic and reason. How good a problem solver are they? This is a raw ability to some degree, certainly something that can be improved upon with practice and development, but it is also correlated with potential. Thirdly, what motivation does someone have to lead? What are the qualities that it energize and engage someone? And the research here indicates that 2 qualities in particular that are motivational contributors are challenge and collaboration. That is, being engaged by complex problems and being eager to work with others to solve those problems. Fourth, the track record of relevant experiences, which we alluded to on the prior page as well. And finally, a notion of being sure that if there are potential risks of derailment, that they are managed well. So, for example, ensuring that some prospective leader is not overly involved or engaged in micromanaging their subordinates, and also ensuring that they have a high level of self-management. That is, they are not volatile at times, are good indicators of prospective potential from a leadership perspective. What do these boil down to? Essentially, on the right side, two qualities. One is the capacity to learn from experience. There's a great deal of research over many decades that indicates that people who can learn from experience and apply that learning to their next opportunity will be able to move into leadership roles at successively higher levels at a faster pace. So understanding whether and how someone learns from experience is absolutely critical. And secondly, the degree of self-awareness that one has, that is, that they can articulate and understand their strengths and their weaknesses, both through their own understanding of themselves and through their openness to feedback from others and their willingness to absorb and learn from that feedback and adjust accordingly at the same time. So one term that is widely used in essence to embody this set of qualities or these aspects of leadership potential is the term learning agility. And let's take a look at that term and its components a bit more closely. So what is learning agility? It is a quality that indicates the capacity to know what to do when you don't know what to do. And our research and that of others suggests that these are the most prominent considerations in predicting the ability to lead at higher levels. So if there's one quality and one quality only that you would want your senior executives to be focused on in your organization, we would define and describe it as learning agility as follows. Someone who has results agility, which means the ability to deliver results in challenging first-time situations. That is to say, they're thrust into a role that is unfamiliar to them, but are capable of obtaining meaningful, significant, lasting results in that situation. Moving from results agility to self-awareness, which we talked about extensively on the prior page. Again, the extent to which they have a full understanding of what their strengths are and certainly what their challenges or weaknesses are. Mental agility, which is the ability to examine problems in unique and unusual ways, what we sometimes describe as being able to think outside the box, connecting dots in ways that perhaps are not understood initially but ultimately prove to be the most successful and innovative ways of solving problems. Having people agility, which is the capacity to be a skilled communicator and someone who communicates effectively with many different types of people. A next generation leader with people agility would be someone who is as comfortable during the night shift on the floor as they might be in a boardroom giving a presentation on the key aspects of their responsibilities and the accomplishments of their organization. And finally, change agility, someone who is comfortable with, as we would say, the heat of change, very willing and open to experiment with new solutions as they come to the table and as the environment around them, as it does in healthcare so frequently these days, shifts rapidly. So once we know who our future leaders are, we've gone through an exercise to determine who has learning agility, who has self-awareness and the capacity to learn from experience. How do we develop them most effectively? And all of the research in this space is clear and consistent. 70% of the development that they will need will have to come from the assignments or the roles that they hold. So while it is often alluring to send your high potentials to expensive courses and classes, what we know in reality is that while it will help a bit, what will help far more is putting them into challenging, new, and larger roles, roles that are unfamiliar to them, roles that stretch their talents, and diverse roles so they can explore the range of capabilities that they have, the range of agilities that they have as well, and apply the lessons they can learn from experience in one role to the next role. The best leaders, again, will thrive in this type of rotation or movement from one role to another. And the third component of this are the mentors and coaches and direct managers who will work with executives and next generation leaders as they develop. So the people to whom they can turn for wise counsel, the people who will provide them with insight about the dynamics of their organizations, the people to whom they can appeal when they're frustrated or not experiencing the level of success in a new role that they had in their prior role, and whose wise counsel will ultimately enable them to continue developing as next generation leaders. So I'd like to revisit those initial 4 steps that we spent a few moments on a few slides ago and talk in a little more depth about what expectations you should have as trustees for your organizations and their attention to next generation leaders. And this would be, in an ideal world at least, how the process would unfold. In essence, in 2 phases, the first called Talking Talent and the second called Talking Development. And in this example, we have some specific actions that we believe should be taken at each of these steps. So that scale activity is the manager making an initial diagnosis using a simple, consistent set of criteria related to qualities like learning agility as it is defined for the particular organization we're talking about. Secondly, the calibration, that is going beyond the individual and engaging in a group discussion amongst the people who have seen that individual in action to get a more complete picture of what that talent looks like in an organization. Some people here would talk about using a 9-box model or a 6-box model. In essence, what matters is that performance is on one dimension, potential is on the other dimension. They are talked about separately, and decisions are made about where people fall on that particular structure as determined in this calibration session. Then we move to talking about development. As we look at where people might fall in terms of their performance and potential, what is the right development for each person? What is this so-called differentiated development that will enable them to realize the potential they appear to have? And finally, and again, most importantly, from my perspective, ensuring that there is follow-through with individual development plans so that a year from now, 6 months from now, when there is a review of what was agreed upon in Step 3 on the basis of the work in Steps 1 and 2, we see progress. And if we don't see progress, we're in a position to ask questions about why that progress has not been obtained and what needs to be done differently in order to obtain it. So with all of this as background and information regarding the talent in the organization that might become your next generation leaders, what is the role of a trustee in this process? On this page, I've tried to identify the 4 expectations that you should have when you begin a conversation around next generation leaders. First, expect that your CEO will include this group of prospective leaders as a regular discussion item at board meetings, and ensure that that conversation is rich and includes the insights that the CEO himself or herself has with respect to the amount and quality of next generation talent that they believe that they have, and if for whatever reasons they feel that it's lacking, what they are intending to do to try and attract more talent or develop more talent for that purpose. Number two, ensure that there is a development plan in place for each senior executive, but that plan requires specific insights about next generation leaders in that organization, so that part of the development for each person on the CEO's team is to report in on what they are doing to develop their next generation leaders, in particular a successor or two to their role, but any and all people in their organization who have been so identified as next generation leaders. Third, make sure that there are opportunities for people at this level to present to the board. Provide them with that forum in which you can personally experience their impact, their insight, and their capacity to influence and communicate their ideas and their vision for their particular area of responsibility. And fourth and finally, ask for an annual update on the progression of those who are identified as next generation leaders. That is, back to this question of accountability, what specific development has been committed to, what is evident in the organization, and if it's not evident, what steps is the leadership of your organization taking to try and close the gap to ensure that you have a robust group of next generation leaders moving through various levels in the organization, obtaining the experiences and the breadth of exposure that they will need to be the leaders of the future for your healthcare organization. We've included on this page several questions for discussion that you can use in the follow-on to participating in this webinar. I hope that each of these will stimulate some further thinking for how you can become more involved with and familiar with those next generation leaders in your organization. And finally, here is contact information for the AHA's Trustee Services Organization, as well as for myself, should you have any questions or seek any additional information related to this webinar. And with that, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.